In a comic world, what is a multiverse? Just like what the theory of multiple worlds suggests, there could be an infinite number of variations of what that might be. For Marvel, and cinematic multiverses in general, however, it seems to be a thinly veiled excuse to bring in as many nostalgic cameos as possible. But is that all the multiverse ever was to begin with? Welcome to Sandwich Reviews. I'm the Talking Sentient Sandwich, and to me, there are two answers to what a comic book multiverse is. And keep in mind, this is dumb comic book rules, neither pertain to the actual scientific theories of parallel Earths. But the first answer is a narrative tool that is used to make things less complicated. A method to explain real-life mistakes or inconsistencies in an overarching story. Why did the Flash introduce himself to the new Green Lantern as if they'd never met, even though just last week they were on an adventure together? It was because the mainline comics and the back issues were happening in separate universes. Duh. More often than not, that works for me. It can come off as lazy, but so long as the writing isn't too self-congratulatory, it's fine. There are plenty of bad examples that make the whole idea sound foolish and backwards, but great stories like Flashpoint or Jonathan Hickman's current Ultimate Universe run have allowed that concept to endure past the complaints. So, despite some great examples like those, why have so many moviegoers decided that they've had enough with the multiverse stories? Partly because multiverse stories are extraordinarily difficult to tell, but that would also be because of the second answer as to what a comic book multiverse is, which is that it is a tool to make something more complicated. Adding variations of characters we already know, or creating a whole nother parallel world with an Elseworlds/what-if story that, if successful, will inevitably tie back into the mainline universe. Now, that sounds inherently bad, and filmmakers do tend to attempt to go for that first one for that very reason, but I need to be clear that in and of itself, using the multiverse to add variations isn't bad. It's the filmmakers and studio heads leaning on that concept as a crutch that makes a complicated story like that bad. Because some of the best stories can be described as complicated. It's a reductive term, but it is true. I guess it really depends on the day, because sometimes I do just want to shut off and watch an Aquaman type movie, and by that I mean guilty pleasure. But the best example I can think of is Batman, though that's probably just because I'm constantly thinking about him. But in each and every Batman movie, or at least anything we're gonna get in the future, no matter how dark and gritty it is or isn't, it should be an incredibly intricate and complex detective mystery. I would be disappointed if it wasn't. Of course, Batman isn't the only character that deserves a tangled web of a narrative. He isn't even the only detective-style hero in the Justice League that fits that vibe, but he is the most popular example. And on the flip side of that, being complex doesn't automatically make something good either. I welcome any kind of allegory or layered metaphor in a movie. In fact, I think a story is pretty pointless if it doesn't have something like that, but that is only one element of a film that needs to work for it to be a success. If I'm honest, the only thing that needs to be kept in mind when writing a complex story about parallel worlds, a detective noir thriller, or any story for that matter, is that the complexity of the narrative cannot be the focus. Don't get me wrong, that needs to be well thought out, but the story will only be good if the conflict primarily comes from the characters and the battles they have internally. Though it's not like that's new information for any of you sandwich enjoyers, because obviously care should be put into the characters themselves. Just keep that in mind, because we'll get back to that. But for now, let's get back to cinematic multiverses, because they have always been a thing, with or without superhero movies. It's more of a sci-fi notion, but as you might have already noticed, it's not like the multiverse is reserved for that classification of movies, because everything can include a multiverse. I'm most familiar with examples like Star Trek's Mirrorverse, Jet Li's ripoff of The Matrix, Buckaroo Banzai, Wizard of Oz, or my personal favorite of recent memory, Everything Everywhere All at Once. Side note, Everything Everywhere is just Multiverse of Madness, but better. And I really enjoyed Multiverse of Madness, but the moment I finished Everything Everywhere, the realization hit that it was exactly what Multiverse of Madness should have been. But anyway, I don't doubt the scenario of a multiverse will persist in any movie, no matter the fan base that it is trying to cater to, but that's just because it's an intriguing concept. There are so many reasons as to why someone would want to see a narrative that has one in it. But when it comes down to it, having a multiverse just means that anything is possible. Nothing is off limits. Want to combine the Invincible universe with Robert Kirkman's other fictional works, and even Fortnite? Do it with the multiverse. Hell, DC and Marvel, with their infinitely expanding and contracting multiverses combined into amalgam in the 90s. And that's only the most well-known crossover. There are plenty more. But in the end, the majority of the time that a multiverse is put into a story, it's used to add characters, which isn't always bad. So long as the separate stories are good and I'm entertained, I'm happy. It's looking at the overarching narrative or knowing that we'll eventually get to the big event storylines that makes it difficult to stay entertained and happy with a multiverse saga. And in that, especially lately, it seems to just be an excuse to feature familiar faces. And Marvel has always used cameo appearances with recognizable characters or even objects at the end of their movies to generate excitement. They had Sam Jackson coming in at the end of Iron Man to confirm that it was in fact okay to use his likeness in the comics so long as he was paid enough in the movies. And of course, seeing Thor's hammer at the center of a crater, him appearing in the post-credits of Doctor Strange, or seeing the multiple vertical chins of Thanos at the end of the first Avengers, all were able to set up something that would happen further down the line, and do so by featuring a new face that some nerds might recognize, but really, they're just there to have general fans question what in the world they just saw, so they'll be intrigued for the future. Those post-credit teases must be organically introduced, because moviegoers will always know when something is being shoved down their throat, but those moviegoers should also be unaware and curious about what a post-credit tease is leading to. And on the flip side of that, people shouldn't know exactly where something is hinting at, because that will only mess with their expectations on future projects. It's an incredibly difficult line to tiptoe, and Marvel somehow managed to balance it perfectly in the past, getting audiences interested in new characters by hinting at them in the movie just before it. But lately, it's almost like they've been using those post-credit teases as a distraction, and that's never a good sign, because that is when the multiverse becomes an excuse for cameos. The MCU has thrown out one idea after the next without an actual roadmap or plan for how all of these different and entirely separate elements are going to come together. And there are tons of reasons as to why they've ended up making their recent saga of movies overly complicated, but that also just tends to happen with multiple worlds and alternate variations of characters. And still, Marvel attempts to garner excitement for their upcoming releases using every play that they've learned. It's the same they did in the past, but now we can see the strings, the man behind the curtain furiously seeking to right the ship. So when there's post-credit teases like Clea or Star Fox, which could still turn out to be important, but feels incredibly desperate, begging us to pretty please go to the next Marvel movie, vowing that the story that's implied in the post-credit will get its very own movie, even though a lot of them like Judgment Day deserve a whole phase at the very least. But not just that, Marvel has also promised that those movies are going to be led by massive Hollywood stars even bigger than the ones they already have, hoping that having those actors on screen would get people excited enough to forget how confused they were. But unfortunately for me and many others, that was never going to work, because promising one cameo after another is impossible to include while also telling a meaningful story. People will begin to expect more and more, being disappointed even if there's a mind-blowing character returning, just because it won't be enough to satisfy the audience's growing need for constant gratification. Marvel is probably already aware of that, and most likely was a long time ago, but unless we as an audience change something in ourselves, that problem isn't going to be fixed anytime soon. Yet, as much as I complain about recent superhero movies focusing on recognizable cameos, the fact still remains that doing that makes a whole bunch of cash. I like to think of Marvel and all movie studios as art houses, producing stories that spotlight the greatest or worst of humanity's morals, kindness, and biblically awesome power. In reality though, every single Hollywood studio is a business, and like all businesses, at the end of the day, it's all about profits. Having cameos like Hugh Jackman's Wolverine gets the kind of profits that'll make investors salivate. Plus, if there's one thing I've learned about filmmaking, it's that if something makes a lot of money, soon enough there will be a dozen cheap replications, because you can always count on Hollywood to learn the worst lessons from success. After cementing themselves as a household name, Marvel rightfully introduced new characters. However, once that didn't turn out to be as successful as I guess they were wanting, Marvel went back on that and decided to use their storylines to ham-fist familiar cameos that they know will satisfy the audience, rather than the potential success that they were gambling on. Or at least, that's what I would like to think. I'm sure that the cameos were always meant to be there, but either way, it just wasn't planned out from one project to the next at all. WandaVision started out with a banger of a recognizable character returning, but it didn't even turn out to be the Quicksilver everyone wanted. I will never let Marvel forget how disappointing that was. What even happened there? In any case, Multiverse of Madness went on to feature a whole Illuminati team, which 110% worked for me, consisting of cameos ranging from newly introduced variants to forgotten terrible TV adaptations. Captain Carter was seen from What If, even though the writers of that show have confirmed that it wasn't her, if only to have that specific version of Carter from What If not be cut in half. and that Maria Rambeau's Captain Marvel may also be dead, but she went on to continue that role in a similar light, even though she's wearing the binary costume. And I can only assume that she's in the Fox universe, which, if I had to guess, will eventually collapse into the mainline continuity. But that conversation is for another day, because on the Illuminati, we also got what was the biggest fan casting in recent memory, and that is John Krasinski's Mr. Fantastic, which at the time I genuinely believed was Marvel's new Reed Richards. But Marvel, Sam Raimi most likely, put him in as a wink and a nod to the hundreds of thousands of people calling for him and Emily Blunt to be the mom and dad of Marvel's first family. And it was sadly spoiled by the trailers, which honestly ruined people's expectations going in, because if the trailer was going to confidently spoil a massive cameo, surely there was going to be more. But I still liked Professor X's inclusion nonetheless. At the time especially, I couldn't help but think about Patrick Stewart watching the Logan screening teary-eyed and declaring that he was retiring the character. But if Logan himself can come back as a variant, I guess it's fine for Patrick Stewart. And he was probably the biggest inclusion from the filmmakers, getting the musical sting in the bulky yellow hover chair. But there was one more member that had me flabbergasted when I saw him, because Black Bolt was the biggest surprise from the team. Not just that he was there, because obviously Black Bolt is going to be on the Illuminati. I don't know if we've ever gotten a look at that team without him being on it, despite the group being very distinct to their comic counterparts. Though at the end of the day, they're just as pompous, which is what makes that team interesting. But the fact that it was the same actor from the atrocious canceled TV show was what truly blew my mind. Never in a million years could I have guessed that that would happen. Even John Krasinski's cameo was in the realm of possibility, but Anson Mount appearing as Black Bolt one more time, that's how you use a multiverse. And not just that, the entire team was only there to increase the stakes and make Wanda that much more of a serious threat. And I mentioned before how Everything Everywhere All at Once was the movie that Doctor Strange 2 should have been, but I still liked it. The story easily could have been tighter and just better in general, tying into WandaVision much more smoothly, but the endpoint that it left Steven off at was excellent. Or at least the one quote where he was talking to Wong, and Wong says something along the lines of, "I am satisfied being the variation of me that I am." And I may have really enjoyed Multiverse of Madness, but No Way Home, the next Marvel movie to feature the multiverse, really managed to tell an emotional story. Everyone had already guessed that Tobey and Andrew's Spider-Man were going to be in it, no matter how much they denied that fact. And I do wish the many multiversal villains were attempted to be kept a secret as well, but I guess they had to sell the movie on something, because how else are you going to garner billion-dollar profits? But even if you put everything about the returning villains aside, the fact that Tobey and Andrew's Spider-Man were brought in to develop the idea of responsibility onto Holland further than it already was, even saying the famously misquoted line, was incredible. Those two are characters in their own right, and are given more focus than I was ever expecting, even if I was confident they'd be in it, but they are only there to give Holland's Spider-Man a new perspective. And I guess without them, it still would have been possible to get to the emotional highs that the narrative reaches for, yet I guarantee you it wouldn't have hit as hard if it was Ned and MJ talking to Peter and not the Spider-Man, which is exactly how the multiverse can work. There's nothing wrong with cashing in and selling the movie on recognizable characters, even if they're from a terrible movie from the past. But there needs to be an actual story behind it all. The revelations can't just be that they're there. They need to do something. Which, along with No Way Home, is what I liked about Deadpool and Wolverine. Even though the emotional side of that story didn't hit for me, check out my review if you want to know my full thoughts. But one thing I thought was extremely well done was the reverence that each of the cameo roles were given. Even if some of the other smaller background villain roles like Juggernaut or the Russian guy from The Punisher were just unceremoniously recast. But Channing Tatum's Gambit, who was never even in a movie beforehand, was treated as if they were someone's favorite character. Because I bet in almost each and every showing, there was someone in the audience who really was that character's biggest fan. But if you haven't noticed, all of these multiversal movies do have an overarching narrative that works better or worse depending on the person. But it can't be denied that the story for each is a thinly veiled cameo dispenser, no matter how well the emotional side was written. But those stories I just mentioned only did work because the writers were allowed to craft something that prioritized the emotion. And I'll be the first to admit that I love seeing an actor return to a past role. Something about it just makes the last two brain cells rattling around my mind go wild. And I can only assume that other fans have a similar reaction. And in that, there's this weird rule with fandoms. And this is not a hard and fast rule, there are plenty of exceptions, but whenever I'm looking at a nerdy culture, I can't help but think that given enough time, anything can gain nostalgia. An adaptation or a whole property can be hated and swept under the rug for decades, never wanting to be seen again by anyone. But give it enough time, and enough people will think about it just fondly enough that a studio will believe they'll make enough money if it's included. And I'm being vague because that statement goes along with a lot more than just a superhero multiverse, but if we do bring the conversation back to superhero movies, you can see a lot of examples of that already happening. I already mentioned Black Bolt, but I doubt a lot of people in the audience remembered that Anson Mount had already played the character. But Deadpool 3's outing is where that concept is taken and ran with. I'd argue Blade doesn't quite fit because his movies are great, at least the first two for their time, but Elektra returning from her appalling role in the old Daredevil movie and her own standalone movie, which was somehow worse, my goodness, that was surprising. And I shouldn't even bring up Johnny Storm because that opens up a whole can of worms with people across the multiverse sharing the same face, but I'm hopeful that will at least be acknowledged in Doomsday. And I'm only guessing here, but it seemed like the Punisher they had lost was the Thomas Jane one too. Though I am confident the rocket launcher came from Ray Stevenson's Warzone Punisher, but even with that, there are multiple elements of Thomas Jane's world being hinted at, and I lit up whenever I saw one. But why do I like seeing that? Why was I sad that Vinnie Jones didn't return as Juggernaut? I think it's the safety of it. For the same reason it's comforting to watch the same movie over and over again. It's comforting to see a familiar face, especially in a narrative that would otherwise chart into unseen territory. When someone is rewatching something personal to them, whether from their childhood or just something they've grown to love, they attach themselves to that intellectual property. It could be a character, a whole fictional universe, or even the creator of said work, but a part of their personality becomes possessive of it. So when that character or world is promised to return in some form, they get ecstatic that they get to see their character come back, relieved that it is going to fix what they don't currently like. And knowing that a recognizable face from your childhood is returning can be amazing, but most of the time, when those returning characters come back, they are written by someone who has a different understanding of who that person is. They may not be fully mischaracterized, but they'll act differently. Those differences can be drastic or it could be microscopic, but they will always be seen by the audience's subconscious, which picks up on more than any of us truly know. There are always exceptions, like how Willem Dafoe got the opportunity to give us an even better Green Goblin than he did in 2001, though for me a lot of that simply comes down to the costume. But even in that case, his presence was used to sell the movie, and that's okay. We all know nostalgia brings people to the theater, so why not prey on that? Use it to introduce people to new ideas and characters. Just don't do it in an obvious way where we can see the greed. Marvel has given us big Hollywood names of late, with all the Eternals being cast with recognition in mind, but they've instead gone for confirmed moneymakers. Rather than casting an unknown short, stocky, and hairy guy for Wolverine, Hugh Jackman is probably going to end up playing the role until he's 90, just like Deadpool threatened. And I don't mind Henry Cavill as Logan, though he is much too tall for the comic book look I'm optimistic they'll go for, but it's not like he would do a bad job. Hugh Jackman and Tobey Maguire are reportedly in Secret Wars in some way, and I do want them to be in it, but I don't want them to be central characters. I want Reed Richards, Doctor Strange, Spider-Man, or Captain America to be the protagonist of that movie, which I am hopeful will still happen, but I'm not sure they'll get the screen time they need with Robert Downey Jr. as Doom, who has everything to do with what is wrong with Marvel's trend to acquire a person's butt in a theater seat by flashing a familiar face at them. I can't believe it's taken me this long to bring him up, and I'm sure him and the Russo brothers will make the story fun, but I would so much rather see any other actor take on the role, because the character of Doom is instead being turned into someone who has a built-in connection to Iron Man for some reason. But are inclusions like that what cinematic superhero multiverses ever were? Yes, it's a cheap way to take advantage of nostalgia, but so long as it's written well and the emotion is prioritized over profits, I'm cool with it. And I know I've spent all this time arguing why Marvel needs to not focus on glorified cameos, but you know what? If they're going to make a multiversal antagonist that ties directly into the heroes we're watching, let's get the maker in the MCU. I've already made a video about that topic, but man, I can't stop thinking about how much I'd love to see Miles Teller or even Ioan Gruffudd return to play a distorted and malicious version of Mr. Fantastic. Then again, I would prefer if the focus was given to Pedro Pascal, so if the maker is going to be an antagonist for Marvel, they could wait a bit to introduce him. And I know the comments are still going to be there, but I should also mention that none of these roles I've talked about are really cameos. Usually a cameo is a smaller bit part, but these are actual characters, which is good. If they're going to be included, they should have at least a minute or two of development to get me to care. But what are your thoughts on big Hollywood celebrities and recognizable faces being brought in to basically hustle you into the theater? Are you disappointed that the new Avengers team being set up won't get as much focus? Do you want to see the adventures of that team? Or would you rather have Marvel reboot and recast the original team, which may be the topic of next week? Leave a comment and let me know. And as always, thanks for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe for weekly video essays and reviews, and enjoy a delicious sandwich.